I just have to say that although I have lived within higher ed for about 20 years, I know very little about it. In other words, I have the perspective of a mouse at the bottom. But what we bring to the question, I guess, is I've spent my whole academic life studying the problems of managing innovation. And it just turns out that at their core, the struggles of higher education to do a better job providing a better education and better experiences at reasonable cost are all at their core problems of innovation. And so rather than studying higher ed to reach conclusions about higher ed, what we've tried to do is just take the models or theories about managing innovation and stand to the side of the industry and just put the theories on like a set of lenses, hoping that we'd be able to see a few things in higher ed that other people haven't been able to put in perspective. And so I don't, if I have any expertise, it's in innovation, it's not in higher ed. And so I hope that that's what you'll take from my attempts here, is just to put these lenses on and examine ourselves. One of the things that I never thought about, my first career was I started a company and ran it, which has become reasonably successful. But when I left the company to become an academic, I just never realized how hard it was to learn anything at the Harvard Business School, because you just have a limited perspective. And so I would love to have you guys just knock holes in any of my arguments here, because it's only if you point out what's wrong with our thinking that either of us will be able to improve. So what I'd like to do for about the first 30 or 35 minutes is let me just try to lock through some of these models that we've used to study higher ed, and then from that just have a discussion. And I'd be happy to, if I say something that just doesn't feel right, just nail me on the spot rather than waiting for the end of it. So you can diagram the history of almost every industry as a set of concentric circles. And almost always at the beginning, the original business model in an industry takes root here, where the customers are ones who have a lot of skill and a lot of knowledge. And then innovation makes it little by little more and more affordable and accessible, so that larger and larger populations of people who didn't have the money or the skill to have the original version could now have one of these. And what I'd like to do is just in that context describe this first model that we called disruptive innovation. And the reason why I thought it would be useful is that the mechanism that I'll describe here causes almost every company which at one point is very successful to fail. And at one level, we decided that historically, this mechanism of causing the successful ones to fail hasn't been at work in higher ed. It's really a unique industry. And then we've decided that it actually is at work because technology has changed. So what I'll do is I'll list on the vertical axis the performance of a service or a product over time. In every market, there is a trajectory of improvement that customers are able to use. There's always a distribution in every market, so at the high end of every market, really demanding customers who have very complex problems. And they can be you can never satisfy them with the best that you can give. And at the bottom of every market, there are simple people who have simple problems. And they can be overserved by almost nothing. So that's the first element, is in every market there's an ability to utilize improvement. There's a different trajectory in every market that plots the trajectory of performance improvement that innovating companies provide as they keep introducing better and better products or services. The interesting finding about this is this trajectory of technological progress almost always outstrips the ability of customers to use the progress. And so typically, a technology that's not good enough for what the mainstream customers need at one point is likely going to be overshooting what those same customers need at a later point in time. And a good way to visualize that is just go back to the mid-'80s when we were first learning how to do word processing on those early personal computers. Do you remember how often you had to stop your fingers to let the Intel 286 chip catch up? Because Intel's fastest chip wasn't fast enough to keep pace with our fingers. But as they kept introducing faster and faster chips, a few years ago they introduced their 3 gigahertz Pentium 4 processor. It had shot way beyond what most customers could ever imagine using. Now, sometimes the innovations that help companies move up that are just incremental improvements. Others are dramatic breakthrough improvements. But what we found is that it actually didn't care how complicated it was. The purpose was to sustain this trajectory of performance improvement. What we found is that almost invariably the companies that are the leaders in an industry back here, before these sustaining innovations begin, find themselves still on top of the industry when these battles are over. And it just doesn't matter technologically how difficult it is. If the purpose of the innovation helps the leaders in an industry make better products that they could sell for better profits to their best customers, they almost always figure out how to get it done. But we observed that on occasion, there was a different kind of technology that came into an industry that always killed the leaders. And we called this type a disruptive innovation. We use this word disruptive not because it was a breakthrough improvement, but instead of sustaining that trajectory, it disrupted it by bringing to the market a product that actually wasn't as good as what these people were making back there. But this was a much simpler, more affordable innovation that allowed a whole new population of customers to now own it and use it, who previously didn't have access to this. And it turned out that almost invariably, these things were led by dentrants, which then product became good enough that it sucked the customers out of the mainstream. Now, to visualize how that works, I just want to go kind of stay in the computer industry for a second, and then I'd like to describe with one more slide why that hasn't happened in higher ed in the past, but why I think it will in the future. So if you lived in the Boston area through the 70s and 80s, there was a mammoth company called Digital Equipment Corporation. Any of you remember these things? And through that 70s and 80s, digital equipment was probably the most widely admired company in the entire world. When you read explanations about why they were so successful, it always was attributed to the brilliance of their management team. And then about 1988, digital equipment just fell off the cliff. And when you read explanations about why they stumbled so badly, it was always attributed to the ineptitude of the management team. Same folks running the company. So for a while, I framed the question as, gosh, how could good managers get that stupid that fast? And that is the common explanation that people accept, that somehow a management team that had its act together at one point was out of its league at another. But the reason why the stupid manager hypothesis just didn't feel right is every company that make that class of computers that we call mini computers. If you remember, the mini computer was about this size. Every one of the companies that made that product collapsed in unison. Digital, Data General, Prime, Wang, Hewlett-Packard, Honeywell. And you would expect these people to collude on price occasionally, but to collapse was a stretch. And there just had to be some reason why this whole class of computer companies gasped in unison. And it turned out that this model helped quite a bit. So we don't remember what these things were looking like, but we called these computers mini computers because they were much smaller than mainframes, which was the prior version.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
So I was back in Boston back then, and I remember it was Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was Snow White was IBM. IBM didn't collapse that way, though.
That's right. It's a great question. Can I put you off just for 15 seconds? It's a great question on that. So this computer cost about $250,000. And in order to sell the product, you had to sell it direct to the customer, and the selling process involved a lot of training and support and service. You just had to have costs like that in the business to play in that game. And Digital had to make gross margins of 45% in order to cover that cost, and that's how they made the money. Now, in that time that you were in Boston, there were people coming into senior management all the time with ideas to make new products. Some of these entailed making better computers than Digital had ever made before. In fact, these would be so good that you could start to reach up to the tiers in the market where people historically had to have even more complicated mainframe computers. If you looked at those business plans, they promised gross margins of 60%, and you could earn that percentage on $50,000 or $500,000. So when management was trying to decide if they should make bigger and better computers, there were a lot of other people coming in saying, "You guys don't get it. Look out the window. Everybody's buying personal computers. That's the future." Well, the management could look out the window, and indeed they could see everyone buying personal computers, but they also could see a couple of troubling things. The first one, do you remember how crummy those early personal computers were? In fact, Apple sold the Apple II as a toy to children. Not a single one of Digital's customers could even use a personal computer for the first 10 years that they were in the market. And that meant that the more carefully they listened to their customers, they got no signal from their customers that the personal computer mattered, because in fact it didn't to them. But it could take root in a simple application, which is primarily typing and word processing, and then improve in that context.
And spreadsheet.
Yeah, spreadsheet, that's, yeah.
And solitaire.
That's right. And when you looked at the business plans, it actually got a lot more grim, because you could only generate 40% margins in the best of years. They were headed to 20% quickly, and you could only earn those percentages on $2,000. And so really the choice the management had to make was, I wonder if we ought to make better products that we could sell for better profits to our best customers. Alternatively, maybe we ought to make worse products that none of our customers would buy, that would wreck our margins. What should we do? And it really is a dilemma. As these principles of good management, that you should always listen to your customers and give them the next of what they need, and focus investments where profits are more attractive. They provide very good guidance to managers as long as they're on that trajectory. And then when a disruption comes, those principles of good management makes it impossible to respond. And if you go through just industry after industry, how did Toyota kill General Motors? They came in with crummy little simple subcompacts called Coronas. And then they went to Tercel, Corolla, Camry, Avalon, 4Runner, Sequoia, and then a Lexus. And General Motors and Ford were back here making big cars for big people. And every once in a while, they'd see Toyota coming at them, and they'd say, you know, we ought to go get those buggers. And they'd send down a Chevette or a Pinto. But then they would compare the profitability of a little subcompact with the profitability of a big SUV, and it just didn't make sense. And now, of course, it makes a lot of sense, but Detroit's basically gone. And now, at the bottom of the market, you see the Koreans coming in with simple mark, and Toyota has given the low end to them. But it's not because Toyota's asleep at the switch. Why would they ever worry to defend the least profitable part of their business when they have the privilege of competing against Mercedes, where the market margins are truly extraordinary? Now, coming to your point, there has been on occasion situations where the people that were the leaders here became the leaders in the next generation. And of the mainframe computers, the only one that made the transition to mini computers was IBM. And then of the mini computers, the only one that made the transition to the personal computer was IBM. And the reason why they were able to do that is in each case, they set up a completely independent business unit that had the freedom to create a new business around a different business model and give it a charter to kill the parent. So in this case, IBM, if you remember, set up an independent business unit in Florida and gave it a completely different, the charter to build a business model. And you kind of get a sense that in biological evolution, individual organisms don't evolve. They were just born and they die. But little by little, mutants gain market share. And so a population can evolve even though the individuals within it don't. And you get the same sense in this kind of a system that an individual business unit can't evolve very well. Generally, they're born and they die. But by creating new business units like IBM did, a corporation can evolve even though the individuals within it do not. Yes?
Why did IBM do that? Did they have foresight that Toyota doesn't have and still doesn't have?
It really was a very interesting anomaly. Rarely people do it. Now there's a theory behind it, and so more of them do it actively. But it was really insightful that most others haven't been able to do.
So it was management's insight.
That's right.
On the future of computing.
That's right. So discount retailing, Walmart, those guys, disrupted the department stores. And there were 316 department stores in America in 1960. Only one of them in Minneapolis. What's it called? Hayton Hudson. They're the only ones that caught the next wave because they set up a completely independent business unit that they called Target. All of the other 315 department stores have winnowed down to just 8, of which Macy's is the largest. And why they were able to do that, they didn't have a theory, it was just very insightful managers. That's a great question. When the way the transistor disrupted the vacuum tube went in a similar way. When we were kids, most of us, do you remember a television was about this size? And inside, the technology was based on vacuum tubes that were about the size of a child's fist. And it had to be this big because there were about 20 of these vacuum tubes inside, and they sucked up a lot of power. They were so expensive in today's dollars that it cost about $3,000 in today's money to own TV. The transistor was disruptive because it couldn't handle the power required to build a big machine like this. So every one of the makers of vacuum tube technology bought a license of the transistor from Bell Labs, and they tried to cram it into their existing products. So they spent about $3 billion trying to make transistors good enough at some point that you could make it in the market that they served. And while they were working on the problem, out here, in what I call consuming against non-consumption, by making the product that was expensive simple. The first application was a hearing aid where you couldn't make that thing with vacuum tubes. And then in 1955, Sony introduced the world's first pocket radio. And those of you with gray hair, do you remember how crummy those early transistors were? 10 transistors, but it cost for $2. Horrible fidelity, but Sony sold this to the low end of humanity, people we called teenagers. And the teenagers were delighted with the crummy product because it was infinitely better than nothing, which was their other alternative. And then in 1959, Sony introduced the first pocket or portable television. And again, it was a very limited product, but it was so affordable and simple that a whole new population of people who hadn't had the money to have an RCA, now they could have this one. Because it was infinitely better than nothing, they were delighted with the limited product. And a booming new market emerged out here, while RCA felt no pain, because these are all new customers that could never buy these products anyway. But then by the mid-1960s, solid-state electronics became good enough that you could start to make big machines with it. And within about 5 years, all the customers got sucked out of the vacuum tube world into solid state, and every one of the vacuum tube companies vaporized. And it's sad because they saw the technology coming. They spent more money on it than Sony, but the way they framed the problem is they couldn't see these customers, they could only see these, and to form it into something that was useful was very expensive. Now, two things about this that are relevant to higher ed. The metric of performance changed. What would have been the metric of performance for these products compared to the metric of performance of these products? Those of you who lived in that world. What mattered here was portability, affordability, convenience. Here it was how good the picture looked. And so these people could look at that and say, that's a crummy product. But the customers out here were really happy because they measured performance in a different way. The other important example or insight from this is that the customers were sucked out of the old into the new. It's not the case that the technology developed here and then invades the core. So generally that gets, and I'll see how that is useful in a second. A theory of hybrids, and I guess I got to do this one and then talk about higher ed. Very often you wonder, could I take the new technology and should I put it in this business or that business? Let's look at the electric car. In order for electric cars to work, an important question you need to ask is, are there customers that would love a car that won't go far and won't go very fast? Which is just totally stupid idea back here. But the disruption always starts in simple applications. And so you have to ask, is there a market that have customers who want that. Can you think of that?
Yeah, I happened to be at a Nissan dealer not too long ago, and this new Leaf just came out. It's $35,000. It has a charge that takes you 76 miles, and it's not much bigger than what you showed there.
Yeah, it'll never work.
And they received 14 of them from Japan because they happened right after the earthquake, and they shipped them. All 14 of them were sold.
Is that right? That surprises me.
Yeah, this is something I've done more research on, and I actually want one, but I don't want one like that. I want to pay $6,000 for something that's simple.
Yeah.
That's right.
Because
That's
I know
right.
technology is, it's simple,
Yeah,
but they're trying to put it in that market.
that's exactly what. And so, a great possibility here are the parents of teenagers who love a car that won't go far or go fast. And they just cruise it to school and then go to their friends and then bring it home at night. And it's not allowed to go on the freeway. To make it up here, this is exactly what you're saying. Almost if you try to make it competitive to head-on competition on the California freeway, the Tesla cost over $100,000. And it fits only one person inside of it. So almost always, if you want to go after the main market with the new technology, it has to be a hybrid of some way. And the hybrid allows you to take the best of what you have and add on to that the performance that comes from the new. And almost always, if you try to cram it into the established market, it requires a hybrid. And this will only work if you can deploy it in a simple application first. So let me just give some thoughts about higher ed. So one of our colleagues, you only develop better theory if people are always looking for anomalies to your theory. Because that's the only way you can say, geez, there's something something else going on. And so my student called me about 5 years ago and he said, hotels don't go through disruption. And I'd never thought about this before. But Holiday Inn in the 1950s, they came in at the low end of the hotel market, but they couldn't move up market. It's clear why the higher cost hotels didn't go down after Holiday Inn, but Holiday Inn didn't go up. And McDonald's came in at the bottom of the market, and the nice restaurants didn't go after McDonald's, but McDonald's didn't move up market. And it took us about 5 years to get this, what I think was an idiot simple insight. And that was for the disruptors that we have looked at, whether it is computing or cars or mini mills that disrupted the integrated steel mills. There was a core of technology or a core in the business model that was extendable up market. That the same technology that allowed a Toyota to make Corona could be extended to make better and better products. And the microprocessor inside an Apple II is extendable to make better and better products. But in the hotel industry, they don't have this extendable core. If Holiday Inn wants to move up to a higher price point, they have to hire a concierge just like Four Seasons have to have a concierge. And so in the hotel business, as they tried to move up market, they had to replicate the cost position or the business model of the people that they were trying to emulate. They couldn't disrupt them. And so in hotels, there hasn't been disruption of the sort that we talked about for computers. And looking back on it for higher education, there has not been historically an extendable core that would allow somebody at the bottom of the market to disrupt the more complicated and expensive colleges up high.